Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am speaking with Alentina Vardanyan. Alentina is a PhD candidate at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. She has a bachelor's from UCLA, master's in Columbia University, and currently she studies organizational behavior, psychology, and how those worlds impact artificial intelligence. And that's what we talk about in this episode. We start out by talking about her story from transitioning from psychology proper to AI and work with AI. We talk about what is intelligence and what it isn't, and some of the different forms of artificial intelligence. She gives a brief history of AI. And then we talk about some of the ethical questions. She brings up a recent app called Replica, which is a type of online therapy, and some of the challenges that it has ethically. We by no means give an endorsement for it one way or the other, but we talk about the ethical considerations of how this application could create some dependency or otherwise. We talk about, how all of these different forms of AI, they're begging the bigger question of reality and what is real and how do we know what's real from simulation. We continue that conversation by talking about the ethics of automation and the future of AI. We talk about whether technology is moving too fast. And then we talk about, AI as it's represented in science fiction films and books. And then we end with talking about the future of AI and where things are going. I have to say, Alentina was quite lovely. She was really, really, really wonderful by giving her time and her energy and just really kind of giving us the cutting edge stuff that's going on with AI in different fields and different places of study, and why we necessarily shouldn't be catastrophizing things, but we should also be very mindful of how we interact with AI. It was a great conversation. I really had a fun time, and I hope everyone enjoys listening to the conversation. And so now I bring you Alentina Vardanyan. I'm here with Alentina Vardanyan. I hope I got that right. How are you? How's it going?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to have you on. I've been wanting to talk to you for a couple months now, I think, and you study some pretty interesting stuff. So I'm really excited to talk about that and have listeners hear all about what you're doing. So maybe just tell us, kind of your brief snapshot of who you are, what you're doing, what you're studying, where, all that good stuff, all the relevant stuff.
Yeah, of course. Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I'm excited we met on Clubhouse.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I'm currently doing a PhD at the University of Cambridge. And so I have a background in psychology, and I'm studying organizational behavior at the business school here. And so I'm taking a behavioral lens to study artificial intelligence. So I'm looking at how AI is being used and implemented in the workplace, and then looking at the human-machine collaboration and what that means for, things like learning, creativity, job design, and just overall the topics that surround, psychology, organizational behavior in the workplace. And so, one of my projects specifically looks at AI and creativity. And so I've been interviewing different fashion designers and stylists, trying to understand how they're working with algorithms and algorithmic feedback and how they're using the algorithm's feedback in their design process. So some of these stylists and designers will get the suggestions from the algorithm, and then they have to work with those suggestions to decide what they're designing for their next collection. And it's really interesting to hear, how they're collaborating with the AI system. That's a quick summary of what I'm doing.
No, that's wonderful. How far along are you in the program? Are you on the just in the beginning, or towards the end, or somewhere in the middle, or
I hope towards the
oh,
end.
towards the end? Yes. Yeah, that sounds right. um, I guess one thing on that I'm interested in is what how did you go from psychology to how behavioral interactions work with artificial intelligence and with humans? That's not always a, maybe not necessarily jump is not the right word, but that's not usually a connection that people will make, at
Yeah.
least in the US. People don't usually make that kind of jump. How did you decide to do that, and what motivated you to kind of want to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my background, well, I did my undergrad in psychology, and then I did a master's in education. Then I worked in academia for 5 years. So I was an academic advisor, and I was also teaching critical thinking. And so when I was working, I became really fascinated in terms of like understanding job design and motivation, and all of the psychological aspects of working. And so when I was looking at PhD programs, I specifically wanted to look at organizational psychology, organizational behavior. And so initially, when I came to Cambridge, I was looking at job crafting. I don't know if you're familiar with the research on job crafting. So it's basically looking at how the employees themselves craft jobs to increase meaningfulness at work. So even though you may have your job description and specific criteria, you work within that to try to create something that works for you. And at that time, I started seeing a lot of news on artificial intelligence, and of course, there was a lot of hype in the a few years ago. Well, there still is, but at the time, there was a lot more. And so at the time when I was looking, I was studying job crafting, and then there was a lot of AI in the news. I just became a lot more curious in what AI means for the future of work. Of how are we going to implement AI in a way that it increases as opposed to decreases meaningfulness and motivation in the workplace. And so there were two papers in the management literature that really motivated this area. There's one by Michael Barrett, and he's at Cambridge, and he did this study with robots in a pharmacy, so robot dispensers, and looking at what that meant for the technicians, so the pharmacy technicians, and what it meant for the pharmacists. And so it was looking at how it helped versus hurt the technicians and the pharmacists. And then there was another paper by Matthew Bean, and he did his PhD at MIT, and he's now a professor in California. And his was looking at the use of surgical robots for resident physicians, so medical school physicians who are in training to become, full-time physicians. He looked at a group that was using the surgical robots, and he looked at another group that wasn't. And what he found was that the physicians that were using the surgical robots, these are called the Da Vinci robots, he found that these residents weren't really learning the nuances of the job. And so the paper is called Shadow Learning. And that really got me thinking into just thinking about, what does it mean for the future of professions? What does it mean for different areas? Because, when we think about artificial intelligence, oftentimes we think about it as kind of automation in labor work. So we think of it as, in big factories. But what we're seeing the shift that's going towards not just labor work, but also knowledge work. And so if we see robots, doing tasks that pharmacists would do, or pharmacy techs would do, or physicians would do, and how that's changing how they're learning about their job. I think that's an area that we really need to explore because, if you think about doctors 50 to 100 years from now, like if all they're doing is learning by watching a robot do the job, what does that mean for the future of doctors? Do they just kind of become technicians watching a robot do its job? Because a lot of work is, getting your hands dirty, getting your hands in there and learning those little, the nuances of the job. And it's those nuances that you do day in and day out that really help you learn the details of the job, right? And so that's how I went from psychology to job crafting to AI. And Yeah, and I think another thing that really motivated me was this intense hype around AI that we see, by major publications, whether it's New York Times or The Economist or whatever it may be. And I think it's a massive disservice to the field overall. To constantly hype it up because we can talk a little bit about the history of AI, but when we see the past, we see that AI went through these like booms, and then it had its AI winters in the 60s, 80s, and early 2000s where the hype was so high, but then the technical abilities didn't live up to it, and so then governments and universities kind of they decreased the funding in AI research because they saw that it didn't live up to this hype. So yeah, it was a combination of all of these things that led me to the point that I am.
As I talk to a handful of people now, and both in my day job, right, clinical work, and then I guess here as well in the podcast, and it's always so fascinating to me. It's true for me too, but it's so fascinating to hear how like people start out, when they're young and they're really eager to do things in the world, and they have some different paths they take than the one they initially set out to, maybe, or big changes. And and then when you hear their story 10, 15, 20 years later, it's like, I started here and now I'm here. And it's so fascinating how it's very true for most people, if not all people. And just seeing all the like twists and turns and how people do it is always super fascinating to me. I think the kind of the constant there, though, is there's always this kind of like this IO kind of aspect to it, right? So the industrial organizational psych piece. It sounds like that was always kind of there, and then different experiences in your degrees and all of where you're at now. It sounds like that was always there. This what is the psychology of work? What is the value we place in work? And all of those elements sound like have always been of some interest to you, or something that is always kind of humming in the background, which is cool. And then how you're doing it in such a very, I don't even want to say modern way, it's almost futuristic way of sorts of, doing like right there where, 5, 10, 15 years from now, where how does AI that we have now, what does that tell us from, the future and things like that. So, I mean, all of that is super fascinating, super cool. So,
and going forward, I think that's going to be really important for people who are in college now, because when we are thinking about how AI is being implemented into the workplace, even something like GPT-3, where it's writing content, of course, it's not that great, but the technology is there and it's being developed. So I think it's important to keep this open mind and not just think tunnel vision of going, from point A to B in your career, and just being flexible and knowing when you need to pivot and detour a little bit, and it's okay to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. So let's, when I was thinking about our conversation, I said, kind of like what you alluded to in there was that people talk about artificial intelligence in a very colloquial way, or very casual way, or kind of in a trending way of sorts. And I thought it might be helpful to ask you about, how do you define these terms? And I typically don't like conversations that have to deal with defining terms, because it gets really kind of in the weeds. But what is, in your mind, what is intelligence? And is there an important distinction between artificial intelligence, and I guess the other end of it would be human intelligence? I'm not sure how you would make that distinction, but how do you define, I guess, the kind of the major terms? And then we can talk about what it looks like.
Yeah, I agree with you about definitions. I also don't want to give a dictionary definition of what is intelligence, because that can get boring really quickly. Yes. But I think if we're just thinking about intelligence, I mean, it's just higher level abilities, right? So it's problem solving, it's decision making, abstract thinking, reasoning, learning to learn, creativity. So these are all abstract level abilities. And when we think about artificial intelligence, is we're hoping that a system, a machine, can perform similar tasks. So the machine will be able to problem solve and make decisions and, be creative and learn to learn. And we see some of this already with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. But, I think the part where we make a mistake is where we try to define, or we hope that the machine will learn in the same ways that humans do.
Mm-hmm.
So we expect that the machine will think abstractly the way that humans do, or problem solve the way that machines do. And that's not the case. I don't know if that will be the case eventually, but I think it helps to just look at what the machine is doing and understand that it's, making a decision in its own way and not necessarily the way that a human would make the decision. So one of the examples, I'm sure you've heard of this because it's one of the most popular ones, but it's the game of Go, and how Lee Sedol lost to the machine.
I know about the one with the chess player that lost the machine. So it's sort of analogous kind of comparison.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that one was with Gary Gasparov in 97. And then this is with Lee Sedol a little bit later. I can't remember the year, but so what it did is in game 2, it was move 37, that the machine made a decision. It made a move that no Go player has ever made that move because it's considered a novice move. And so even the professional players and the enthusiasts, they were looking and laughing and thinking like, okay, the machine completely like messed this up. Like, of course, it's not smart to make this move. But what happened is after it played that move, it actually won in a very creative way. So we can say that that was a creative move, but it's not creativity the way we would define creativity, or it's not decision making the way we would define decision making. And and now they've analyzed that game and they've actually learned from that game. They're like, okay, that's an option that we had never considered, but it's there, but yeah, I mean, if we think about like philosophically about just artificial agents and artificial beings, I mean, this goes back to like the 17th century, right? It goes back to, let's say, Thomas Hobbes, where they talk about what does it mean to be an artificial being. So yeah, I think anytime you talk about AI, you kind of have to draw from philosophy and ethics and psychology and look at it all together as opposed to just computer science. It can't be viewed as an isolated field on its own. But yeah, and then in AI, of course, then we have the narrow AI and the AGI. So narrow AI is often defined as machines that do very narrow and specific tasks with defined goals, whereas AGI, the future is looking, into its artificial general intelligence, where it's this idea of having the robot or the machine kind of be all-encompassing and be able to have general intelligence. And that is very futuristic. I personally don't like to get into those conversations because I think it's just a lot of theorizing and hypothesizing. And so I don't know. I mean, some people will say it's coming up in the next 5 to 10 years. Others will say it's, in the next 20 to 30. Some say it's not going to happen. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll say about the intelligence piece, because, in terms of intelligence, you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different definitions of sorts. But my definition is similar to yours. I usually think of it as how to solve, complex novel problems, right? It's how are we able to do that in kind of abstract ways? I also think of it that way, and that can blend out into the cognition aspect of things. It can blend into the emotional and creativity pieces of it as well in terms of humans. And I always think about artificial in terms of things that are not they're not living organisms, right? Because you can have animals that have some form of intelligence. You can quantify it that way. And obviously humans have this construct we have as intelligence, but there are, things that we have with machines that are made by humans, I guess, and that they are not living organisms, right? They are entities of sorts. And so, but to your point about that the machine is going to solve problems in different ways, and that they're going to express, let's say, the creativity aspect of decision making in different ways than how humans would do it. People, I think there is one that when people hear that, there's different ways you can receive that, right? The first way you can receive that is one of some fear and anxiety of like, oh my goodness, this thing is thinking, or there's some aspect of that that is on its own. And if it can do that, and we don't know how it's doing it, or it's doing it in a different way, what does that say of what it can do? And could it do things we automatically think in terms of harm, right? Is it going to harm humans or harm the creators, if you will? And there's another way of taking it, which is, well, isn't that what everybody wants, right? So as an example, when I type something into Google or YouTube or something, I don't want to do all that searching, right? I want the AI to do it for me, right? That's what I want. That's right. I can remember a time before the internet, and it sucked, right? In some ways, because it was like, yeah, I had to do all this work to just do something. I think you could probably go even further, right? Something like, I don't know, maybe you can tell me what you think, and if you would quantify it as AI or a type of AI, but it might be the first form you were talking about, but something like a dishwasher or a washing machine, right? For people that had to hang their clothes, and still in some parts of the world, hang their clothes on a clothesline and wash it by hand in a river. And now we don't do that in the Western or modern world. There's a machine that does it, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of examples. But so in some ways, I think people have this reticence towards like that kind of dystopian, creepy, like, humanoid robotic kind of thing, but which there are elements of it. With the game example is fair. But there are other things that we like where it's more unilateral, and it's just like, okay, or unitary, excuse me. And it's, well, if I ask Siri or Alexa for what the weather is, it's just a shortcut. So I don't have to look it up, or I have to do something. That's what I want it to do. I don't want to have to do all those things. And so maybe talk a little bit about that, about a little bit of people's kind of attitudinal kind of approaches, or how they're receiving some of these aspects of artificial intelligence that we have at the moment in our lives.
Yeah. So I think what you're describing, well, the way I was thinking about it is the spectrum of technology, right? So I think the way we receive it depends on how low or high it is on the spectrum. So if we think about automation, or very specific coded things, then that's different from, let's say, machine learning algorithms. So the difference is that, let's say a computer program, like you open Word and you start typing it in. So it's programmed to know what you're typing in and what the response will be. So you're always going to get the same thing, or it's like walking through a sensor. It's like you walk through it and it gets activated. It's always going to be the same thing because it's programmed to do only that. So it's like the engineer specified the rules, and now the rules are set in the machine, and it always responds the same exact way. So there's no fear in that, because it's always going to respond in the same way. So you know what to expect. Yeah. And also, if you don't understand it, you can kind of just trace your steps back, whether it's, the actual formula or the technical features of the machine. You just trace your steps back and understand why it's doing what it's doing. I think the fear comes when there's that black box effect, and we get that black box effect when it's, machine learning algorithms, and when it's deep learning and neural nets, because it's going through many layers of abstractions. And so you don't understand which pathway it went through to get to this solution. So I remember a while ago, I was speaking to an economist about this, and they were using tree search. And he said that, sometimes it's even more frustrating when you get the result, when you get the final output, because you're kind of scratching your head thinking, how did it get to this point? And, there is no formula for you to go back to the mathematical formula and say, okay, it got from A to B to C to D. And I think that's the frustrating part. And so that could be whether it's, your personal job task, where like it was for the economist. And then when I speak to the fashion designers, they also feel the same way, because let's say the algorithm might say something like, we want you to design this certain silhouette in a linen and in this color story. And so the designer might look at what's going on in society and look at trends, and then try to understand, wait, why is the algorithm telling me to design in this way when, let's say, like a tight dress versus a loose one, where what I see on social media and on the runway are loose fitted dresses. So it's this kind of mismatch between what the algorithm is telling you to do or suggesting for you versus what you think should be the output. And when it comes to us on a personal level, like you're saying, Siri and Google search, I think that happens a lot with social media algorithms. Like when we look at our home feed, we kind of don't understand why we're seeing certain things. I mean, other times we can understand because, we've searched for it or it's linked to something similar. But then, I'm sure this has happened to you too, but sometimes you get something and you're just like, wait, why do I keep getting these suggestions? What is it trying to tell me? And, we might not fear it initially, and we might not think it's such a bad thing until it puts us in some sort of like this echo chamber. And then that's when we need to be cognizant and we need to be active and try to search, opposing thoughts, opposing viewpoints, so that we're getting more of this like holistic view of what's going on in the world, as opposed to just this, very specific, narrow-minded focus on it. So yeah, I think this whole concept of us being afraid of AI comes down to transparency, of how transparent the algorithm is and how transparent just the overall system is of, you put in this input and you get this output. Like, what's the I guess, the process for that? What is it going through?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. The transparency piece is the really difficult part, right? Because we don't know how it got to this answer. Well, what the hell am I supposed to do then when I don't know? I can't fix it. I can't, but then I have to trust this machine. It's not human, and a human created it. How could it, be smarter? And I think in the one sense, it's like, well, that's the whole point, right? The whole point is that you don't have to do that. You don't have to do all that work. And you can think of other technologies now with, I think of like genetic testing in DNA. It's like, how explosive that is. 15 years ago, we couldn't do that stuff. It was like, you're going to have to dig through a minefield, to years and years and years. And now it's just like faster and faster in one way. So, and I think that, I guess this will help us kind of for the other point in the conversation, but you talked about Hobbes, but how do you see where, you don't have to do a whole long history, but where do we see like the beginnings of like what we would call AI, and then kind of big moments through time of AI to where we're at now? And I have some other questions about the more current stuff, but maybe just kind of give the overview very briefly about where it kind of starts and kind of how we got to where we're at, now with artificial intelligence.
Great. Okay. So, well, the initial conference that we all know about, it's, the Dartmouth conference that you had researchers from Harvard and Bell Labs and Dartmouth and IBM. They proposed a research project to go and study this new field of study called artificial intelligence. And they were, I think, in some ways inspired by the cybernetics and Macy conferences that took place in New York before that. So it was in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Right. And then this AI conference that took place in Dartmouth was in 1956. And so that's where the term artificial intelligence was coined by John McCarthy. And then, of course, like there was this excitement and a lot of research and funding. And then in the 60s, we saw a bit of a dip. And then again, it was an increase. Sorry, I'm not saying the specific dates here because I can't recall them.
That's okay. That's okay.
And then we went through another winter. But I think the resurgence that we're seeing now, a lot of, is due to just access to data because of the internet. And just, when you're talking about like genetics and CRISPR and everything kind of exploding, and even just search getting so much better, it's all because of data. So because we've been using smartphones and smart machines and just the internet a lot, all of our activity, whether it's our, searches or it's residual activity, so it's the time that we spend on a certain page or on a certain picture, or, how much scrolling we do. So all of that behavioral data is also collected. And so that's what's helping this whole resurgence of very smart machines. And plus, with that, we also have greater processing power, right? So we have the GPUs that are stronger, and now we have cloud storage. And so cloud storage has made it possible for both small and large companies to be able to use, to be able to create and use different AI systems. So before, all of this was reserved for, a few tech companies, so the Amazons and Facebooks and Googles, and also a government, just government agencies. But now, because of the availability of big data, and then the processing power increasing, and just cloud storage being available, we're seeing a lot of startups in this area, and we're seeing just the machines getting smarter. And I think also a lot more creative ideas, creative ways of using data, and creative ways of using these machines. Like, for example, we like fashion is one I wouldn't have thought of initially. And then just the whole like copywriting, there's so many copywriting applications where you just could put in a few ideas, and then you can select, let's say, you want this written in the style of Jane Austen, and it could spit out something really beautiful for you. So yeah, that's I would say those are the three main reasons. And of course, investment too, right? So we're seeing more investment in this area, so it's just getting a lot more advanced.
Is there a domain in society that AI hasn't been impacted by? Right. So you're saying like, well, it's just everything, right? Things that fashion, you don't really think that would be, implementing AI, but now we can see that it is. And there are many, 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 many fields and disciplines and domains within our society. But even if you go all the way down to agrarian society still, I know at least in the United States, I know maybe other countries in the world, there are many farmers that are using so much intelligence now, which is great. It's so much easier in some ways, and so there's just so many different domains. Is there really any square inch of society that hasn't been impacted at this point, or it'd be hard to find, right?
Well, I haven't thought of everything, but like you, I have been going through different industries and trying to think, okay, how could AI be used in this field? And one field I didn't think it would be good in is psychology.
Yeah.
Seeing a therapist. But I don't know if you've heard of this startup called Replica.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I don't know how I feel about it, but basically, it was created. The person who started it had lost a close friend, and so she had asked friends and family to kind of send all the messages and emails from this person who had passed away. And she uploaded that information, and then created a system where she could text him and he could text back in his style. And so, and now there's this app called Replica where you can sign up, and you basically have like an AI friend that you chat with who's kind of like a therapist. And it's quite interesting. There's an entire community on Facebook if you want to check it out. But, people talk to their AI system on a daily basis. They'll share things like how they're, going shopping and what they should buy and whether they should go to this event and how they felt that day. And, it really reminds me of the movie Her.
Yeah, I was thinking that, yeah.
And a bit of Black Mirror. And I don't know, it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable to think that may be the future. I understand that there could be, it could help some people, but I think that's where we need to think about, okay, how far do we take this, and where do we, stop? Because I think it could be detrimental to the person too. If you kind of become addicted to this non-living agent, that's just, I don't even know what to call it. It's just, it's an app on your phone. It doesn't exist.
Well, this bleeds into the next topic I wanted to discuss, which was the ethics of AI. So this sounds like one of those ethical quandaries. So, right, it's the first time I'm hearing of it. So my first response is one of interest, curiosity. There's another response for me that's like, yeah, absolutely not. And then there's another part of me that's like, what are some beneficial aspects to this? So I'm sort of conflicted. Um, as much as you want to share, I mean, you don't have to share if you don't want to, but what is what is the problems for you, or why are you hesitant about something like that?
Um, I think, well, it's a lot to say in that area. I think, well, I don't have to talk about this specific company, but I can just maybe talk about just the whole
Yeah,
concept of
yeah, the
avatar.
concept. Yeah.
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 Um, I think it comes down to dependency. I think for those of us who have experienced life before social media and before just the use of the internet being so pervasive in our lives versus the children, the teenagers who are born into this. I think
So
there's a
old millennials and above. Yes, we're
yeah.
both showing our age now.
Yes, exactly. I'm fine with that, though. I mean, I feel very grateful that I experienced, life before all of this, and now I can view it critically. I can look at
Sure.
it. I can understand the before and after. Whereas, I have younger cousins, and I worry a lot about how they're exposed to this information and how it's become normalized for them. So
Mm-hmm.
the concept of having avatars is normalized, and this whole concept of just speaking to a bot feels a bit normalized. And so, and I think as we see not just AI technology, but also AR, VR advancing,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to see a lot more of this, right? And if you talk to some people, I mean, I don't want to say I have a pessimistic view of AI at all. I think it could be used in many good ways, but I think that's where it comes down to. It's like, okay, are we going to use this tool or this system to enhance our experience? Are we going to use it to augment our experience, or to create dependency and to diminish our own thinking processes and depend on a machine to do that for us? And, so if you talk to people, they'll say, it's just a tool. And I understand, a lot of things are a tool. Like we can think of, like a hammer is a tool, right? You can use a hammer to build a house, and you can use a hammer to break it down.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily mean breaking it down is bad. Maybe you're breaking it down to build something good, or, if you're building something, are you building a school or a hospital, or are you building that's going to educate people and help save lives, or are you building a casino that people are essentially going to gamble their lives away? So I understand that it's a tool, but at the end of the day, it's like, how are we using this tool? So when it comes to therapy that we're talking about, are we using these tools in a way to really help people who maybe don't have access to therapists, and it's their initial introduction to therapy, or people who maybe feel anxious talking to someone else, so speaking to a bot is easier? So I definitely agree with those things, but it comes down to where do we set the boundaries, and where do we and what do we do with these tools? Like, how far do we let it continue? So and if we're talking about ethics, it's like, whose responsibility is it? Is it the company's responsibility to set these restrictions? Is it up to the person? Is it like, do we want the government to get involved in this process? I think these questions and answers will be very different for every area and for every company that's using it, right? Because, if we're talking about therapists and adolescents, then it begs a different set of questions. And if we're talking about maybe robotics for elderly care who are in, let's say, hospitals or home health care places, then that begs another set of questions. Where we've seen how, using these robots in elderly care, and actually with children who have cancer. There was a recent one called Robin the Robot. That's very sweet. It's used with, children who have cancer. They did a study on this at UCLA and how it's helping them cope through the process. So yeah, again, it's like the spectrum of ethical questions and a spectrum of how involved the system is in and how pervasive it is.
I have I have a few points that we can discuss, so you don't, again, have to give me your codified response or something, but we can dialogue about it. So you're talking about dependency, right? This is your concern, right?
Mhm.
Is this creating a dependency, especially? But so here's the counter, right? The counter is it dependency on something in a particular area? So your conceptualization of therapy might be different than mine or other people's, but I think a general standard definition of therapy is it's a place where you can I don't like the safe space term because I don't think therapy is that. I know what people mean when they say that, but therapy in many ways is an uncomfortable space because you have to deal with a lot of demons, a lot of hurts, a lot of pains. But it's a way of trying to sort yourself out. It's a way of trying to understand yourself, and the self being, it's a loaded term, but who you are and what you want to be, where you come from, but then also the elements of your emotional experience. Yeah. And so, and your phenomenological experience and your interpersonal experiences and the relationship that you create with the therapist is a surrogate for unmet or unfulfilled wishes and relationships that have gone astray and many things. And so it's a very intimate thing, or it can be. Now you're saying, well, if some technology like this exists, that what I heard in there, and maybe that's my interpretation, but well, it's not real, right? You're just you're talking to fragments, or you're talking to this kind of vestige of someone that was there, but it is living on past when they've physically gone. And could that be, in terms of grief and loss or whatever, something where they're not able to let go? And could that be potentially unhealthy? And another way is, well, don't we have dependencies on many things in life already? Right? I mean, that's, some people are complaining about that, but we have many things we're dependent on, and we don't say anything about that, or not as opposed to that. I guess the other thing is it becomes the ontological argument, right? Which is, well, what is real, right? Can I have therapy with something that is not real, or it's not real? It's not real in the human sense. Mm-hmm. I can't help but think of Heidegger here, right? Who his whole Dasein approach of, there's Dasein for humans and what that means to exist that way. And then there are other existentials, other things that exist, but they're not the same way of existing as we are with humans. And that's really what the question is how do we understand what it means to interact with something that we know is not real? We know it's artificial. We know it's a simulation. We know it's, and the question outside of that would be, well, does it matter? Right? Can we interact with something that we know is not real in one part of our mind, or we know that it's maybe delusional of sorts, but if it helps the person, here's a real world example removed from the artificial bit. What about when you have the grandma that's 87 years old and she has pretty end stage dementia, and one of her children dies, right? And all of her other children don't want to tell their parent, right? In this scenario, that one of her children has passed away. And so if she asks, where's so-and-so? And you lie and you say, well, he's not here, or he can't make it. Now, people have different, ethical ideas about this, but the one group would say, well, you would tell the mother, the grandmother, whatever, that this person died. That's being honest. Mm-hmm. And then you could say in another way, like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, she's not going to remember. She's not going to know. And it's only going to cause more harm. Yeah. So why would you say that? And so I think the same thing, it's not a perfect analogy, but the same thing is here is, well, what's wrong with saying, these memories that have been stored, and then this person is talking to this person that does not exist in the same way they did physically in his human presence, but they're still interacting with the remnants of that or vestige of that. And it's it's a simulation, and that's fine. It gives them some respite. It gives them some type of way. Wouldn't you want to depend on something like that as opposed to other things like spending 6 hours on Facebook or 10 hours on Netflix? Wouldn't you want to have more if you had to pick a dependency on something like that? I mean, I'm trying to steel man as best as I can, but what is the, I don't know. What do you think about those things, about this notion of what is real and why is that so important? Because does it make it less authentic if it's not real? And does that always matter, do you think? I don't know. These are questions that are arising to my brain.
No, they're good questions, and they're questions I've asked myself a lot too. And yeah, you're right. It does come down to authenticity. Because, even so with the grandma example, I know you just came up with it on the spot, but I think with the grandma example, she herself isn't fully there, right? So she's not fully remembering and cognizant of what's going on. Yeah. And when I think about this, I mean, like another example might be, social media life versus real life, what we portray versus what we actually live. And I know that the research on this shows that it actually increases anxiety and depression because, it's like, again, this delusion of like one created life versus the actual life. So there's that aspect to it. But I think the part that I'm very concerned about when I talk about dependency is not knowing what the machine is, what kind of advice the machine is giving. So it's not just the dependency on the machine, but also dependency on that relationship. And so if algorithms are dictating what the machine is telling the person, how accurate or how helpful is that information? Does that make sense? So it's like, if you're using it as a therapist, is it helping you, or is it kind of keeping you in that same state of mind? Like, who is guiding the information that the algorithm is outputting? Is it being, checked by psychologists and, behaviorists to make sure that people are getting useful information? Or is it just, using some sort of like deep learning and compiling things?
Well, I think that's one important question. The parsing that out would be, well, if this higher learning, if this machine is doing some type of higher learning, it's going to say and do things that humans wouldn't maybe be able to say or to recognize. How can you come on the back end and check and authenticate? Okay, this gets a thumbs up, this gets a thumbs down, or something. In reality, again, you could make the same argument. Like, how many bad therapists are out there? There's some really terrible ones, right? And they're giving terrible advice. And the problem is that therapists aren't supposed to give advice. That's not what they're supposed to do, right? That's it's not unethical per se. It's not, some form of malpractice, but I mean, depending on the device, I guess it could be, but it's definitely not what therapists do, and it's not what they should do, and plenty do it, right? Yeah, so there's that piece of it. So, but you're right. Is this, I guess my approach with this type of aspect within therapy, we're still on the which areas does it not maybe work so well. I think at the moment where we have things, you cannot, I don't think right now, maybe 50 years, 100 years from now, but I don't think we can simulate what it's like to have a human emotional experience with someone. An example for, the past year and a half almost, many, psychologists and clinicians and therapists, we've all been doing therapy virtually, and that's okay. That's fine. But it has some pretty negative downsides to it. Some of them administrative, some of them technological, but one of the primary ones is you're not in the same room with somebody when they're going through something emotional. And for example, if you and I are sitting in the same room, that's going to have a very different presence, a different feel than how we are right now, right? Not to mention, if you, let's say, share something with me really personal, and really emotional, that's going to be a different feeling than if you were to do it like this. Like you could, you could say you still, you break down and you cry about it, or you're really angry about it, or you're really happy about it, whatever the emotion is. That's fine. You can do it virtually over video, but it's nowhere near the same. And we've realized this over the past year and a half as being in the same room with that person. And again, that's, I think, more of the phenomenology of things. So again, I just don't think that, automated responses, or even if it is, the person's, thoughts and feelings and things like that, it just isn't always going to be the same. And I think that's until we get Westworld or something even better than that, I just don't think that that's going to really happen for certain professions to do that. I think it's always going to be a disconnect. We're always going to know, but this is a robot. This is, whatever. And so I'm with you on the dependency thing, right? I'm doing my best to steel man the argument, but I agree though. It has, I think, for certain individuals or certain folks that are maybe more vulnerable in negative ways, that is a attractive heuristic for people, or attractive shortcut that I think could be harmful and detrimental. I mean, I do agree on that end, but it could have potential upsides as well.
And I think another thing is, when you're talking about being in the same room and having that connection, I think it prevents you from being able to probe your therapist, because like you said, some therapists might actually give very bad advice. And so in that moment, you can kind of ask why, and keep asking, your whys and hows, and how did you come to that? Or why do you think I need to take this approach? And so it gives you space to expand the conversation, as opposed to just having this, a few sentences back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of any conversation, and again, conversations over the phone are fine, conversations over text, but there is something unique and I think irreplaceable about having conversations with somebody in person in the same room. But we haven't quite yet replaced that. I don't even know if that's possible. If you get holograms and stuff really, really good. I mean, there's just something, the material things in the body I think are super important. I guess we can't go through all the ethical pieces of it, but I guess the two that come to mind for me in terms of ethics with AI are self-driving cars, right? And some of the gene editing stuff. So maybe let's tackle the cars thing first. So, and this will bleed into some of the other things you were talking about in terms of work and how we look at the future of work. That, is one aspect of it. But I don't know, what you can just give me your general introductory thoughts about self-driving cars currently, where we're at and where we're going to be in 10 years. Who's making the decisions to not hit grandma or to hit the other car, or who's making that decision? Is Tesla making all this? Is Elon Musk making all these decisions? I mean, how do we engineer the AI for machines like that to make extremely split-second real-time decisions? How are we understanding that, or what are your thoughts on some of those very messy problems?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't looked at it recently, of what the updates are. Since I've started in this area, it's constantly been about self-driving cars, and about the conversation tends to be, it's coming up in the next year, in the next 2 years, in the next 5 years, like truck drivers are going to be completely replaced. So look for a new job, truck drivers. And I don't doubt that we will have it, but again, like you said, it's like a lot of ethical questions and infrastructure questions. And yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, who makes that decision of what the car does? Does it save the people in the car, or does it, save the people who are passing by? To me, I always feel like I may be wrong on this, but I think the infrastructure has to first be set in place before you can really deploy self-driving cars. So you have to have the roads that are built for self-driving cars, because I think to bring in self-driving cars with actual cars, that's where you're going to get a lot of friction.
Yeah.
Um,
Because they're basically operating on two different manuals, essentially, or two different rules, right? You know, if you have the bad driver, we all know what bad drivers are like. And then you have the very clean, very calculated, automated car. They're just, you know, they're playing this, trying to play the same game of tennis on two different courts. I mean, it's very different rules, I guess.
Yeah, and with a lot of research, I feel like, in the lab it looks great,
Mm.
but not in practice. So in the lab, when they're testing on these clean, clean straight roads, then yeah, of course it's going to do well. But try bringing that into LA traffic, or some heavy city traffic, and you add all of these, external complications and features and nuances, and then you're just not going to have that. So I think it would be possible when we have the infrastructure set, but I may be wrong on that part. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of work to do in that area before we can continue.
I'm remembering a question I had earlier, which was about the way we're rapidly going through things. So we talked about it in terms of both of us can remember a time before the internet. I remember that time very well. I remember doing some of undergrad before the internet, and that sucked because I had to go through the library and go to Dewey Decimal System and have these big drawers with all these papers to find where the book was, and using encyclopedias and using all this stuff. And anyway, so it's much easier now, and it was a slower integration, right? But I was thinking about this in the past 10 years. It is insane to me how fast when I think back to 2010, we had, I think, the iPhone 2 or whatever, the 3G, whatever it's called, it's brand new. It was a strange thing to have that. We had phones, but this was just like leaps and bounds, faster than anything else. And then, there was just this cascade of things again, it's almost too fast for me. Like it comes out and I use it and I'm like, okay, I can get with it. Fine. And then there's a new thing and they're all pushing and pushing. So like you're saying, tablets, I remember everyone's like, well, what the hell do I need a tablet for? That's a ridiculous tool. No one's ever going to use it. Now it's like literally everybody uses it. And then like, like a cloud-based system. Like I remember, like it's like, well, where is it? Like it's somewhere. It's like, well, I need to know where this file physically is. Still using the when I actually had files like in a room or something. And so I was like, well, it's on the computer somewhere. It's like it's on a storage place. And so I remember that it took me a while, right? I still don't understand how a fax machine works. So I was like, how does a cloud system work? I don't know. Where do I find this, right? And again, it just. We're so in the past 10 years, the rate at which things are accelerating is fast. It's very, very, very fast. Yes. And I can't imagine what it's like in 2030, 2031. Like, if I look at the past 10 years of where it came, 2010 to 2020, that was nuts, right? Because you have all the time frame, like, because, there was big changes from 2000 to 2010, but it wasn't like tremendous. It wasn't like, every 6 months, every 18 months. But from 2010 to 2020, it's just like, and so now as we do, 2020, let's say 2030, is there a point where is it maybe too fast where we're not integrating things well, or we're not letting things kind of sit? And we can't learn the machine, or we can't learn certain things, or, in a way, is the machine kind of going forward more than we are? So this kind of gets to your point about the human machine learning interaction piece of things. Mm-hmm. Is it too fast, or how does the human machine aspects, if one is moving forward faster than we can, is that okay? Is that fine? Like, how do you think about as we keep accelerating so rapidly in the, as the years go by, what do you think about how we're doing that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, the first part that you said about life before the, internet and everything, I was just thinking, sometimes, so we have a lot of professors who come and give talks and they talk about how they had to actually handwrite or type up their dissertation. And if they made a mistake, they had to, retype the whole thing. And it just makes you think, my goodness, we're so lucky to have all the, technological advancements that we have now. But at the same time, sometimes when I think about myself doing research, so in college I did have the internet and computers, but like I'm talking about, in high school, just doing research without the internet and like going to the encyclopedia, opening it up.
Yeah, yeah,
I just feel like you really immerse yourself in the knowledge
absolutely.
and you appreciate what you read. You appreciate all the information that you gather. Whereas now it feels like, you can save 100 articles and like 100 books and just quickly skim through, look for what you need and put it aside. And then I don't know if you feel this way, but sometimes I feel like there are 1,000 different files open in my mind. And I remember I have read that, but I just can't recall where I read it from. And I'm
That's
driving myself crazy trying to, capture that information.
yeah.
Whereas before I felt like it was more orderly, like I knew
Hmm.
exactly where the flow of information was.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it comes down to cognitive fatigue. It comes down to cognitive overload because it's just bombarded with all this information and not knowing really how to take it all in and digest it in a way that's needed for our work or what we're doing. Um, but at the same time, I think this exponential growth and advancement in technology actually helps us become better learners because we're always forced to learn. Whether you like it or not, you're going to have to learn the new. It's something as simple as the new updates on the iPhone, or learning how to use, let's say, Clubhouse, or learning how to use Python because now you have to use that in some way in your work, or
Hmm.
Final Cut Pro, whatever it is. But it's
Hmm.
it's this constant push to just expand on your skills, and I do like that because I think now we're seeing you can have, let's say, a trained doctor who in the past probably wouldn't need to learn, these extra skills and these extra programs, but now they do. And I'm sure in some ways that also feeds into helping them think creatively about their own job. So I think it's just this overall kind of meta learning that is taking, or I don't know if it's meta learning, but it's just this constant like self-learning and lifelong learning that is embedded in this new lifestyle of advanced technology. I don't
Hmm.
know if that makes
No,
sense.
no, no. I think that's right. I think that I like the way you put it because it's saying that it is causing us to have some cognitive flexibility and how do we continue to learn and to grow and continue to push ourselves in a good way. I'm definitely not one of those folks that say like, oh, it's too fast. Like, I like new technology all the time, especially if it's making life easier. I guess my worry sometimes is that not everything needs to be abandoned, right? Or it's not everything's a replacement. It's an enhancement. We're augmenting things, but it doesn't have to be completely, replaced. So, and sometimes I think that can be very volitional. So when you have kind of like my example from like, something as simple as like a washing machine, right? Well, now people have more time to do other things, right? They don't have to take like, a whole afternoon, a whole day to wash in the river or wash somewhere. I guess some people in the southern countries still do that, but and we can dry it and it's fine. I can do other things while that's happening. Like that's a great thing of technology. And there's many examples of that. The internet is obviously, I mean, one of the best, greatest inventions ever, but but there's some things like, so, I mean, anybody that follows me online will know that one of the things I do often is I'm always just showing what book I'm reading, and and I still buy books in physical, in physical form, and I also read books in electronic form as well. So I'm not one of these snobby people. It's like I only read physical books and that's it. But I found that everything you're saying is right. For me, it's like I can use both, right? And I love having, especially when I was in grad school, having all the articles in the database, and it was like so nice. It's so nice. But like I I use both, but I really enjoy immersing myself in a book and taking my time and flipping the pages and having it be warned. There's an interactive piece that goes missing when I just have it. And I think you interact with it, sometimes in too casual ways if it's only digital. It's the same thing for me in terms of music as well. I have a pretty nice vinyl collection and I collect vinyl, and there's an experience with that, right? I'll put my whatever album is on. I like to listen to albums. And, when it gets to one side, I have to get up and I have to flip it over and, and there's an experience with that and the sounds in the room. And there's the imperfections and the rawness of it that I like, as opposed to, a lossless audio file on iTunes, which sounds crisp and clean and amazing. And I love it. And I love the aspect I can carry all of my music around in my pocket. It's like incredible. But I still like the physical piece too. So I think that for me, I'm not saying people have to do it the way I do it, but I think that sometimes not everything is a replacement for things. Some things can really enhance and make things better. But I think that sometimes we have to just be more purposeful of, okay, because it's there doesn't mean I have to abandon all of these other things. I can use a little bit of both. And I think that does come down to each person's individual kind of choices and how they want to do things. And, so I don't know if you agree or you have other thoughts on that.
No, I love it. I have to say a story. Well, not a story, but
yeah, please.
I think it comes down to character and culture also.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
I'm saying this because, so I grew up in Los Angeles, right? But when I moved to the UK in 2016, I was surprised to see that people still dry their clothes outside, even though we have dryers. And I always ask them why,
Right.
Because then you're creating more work for yourself. Then you have to iron your clothes, and the weather is a bit damp here, so it doesn't fully dry. But the culture is that, and it's not just the English, but it's Europeans who are constantly just drying. Like even today, there were clothes outside in the garden, waiting to be dried.
There is a difference in how it dries. I mean, there is a difference. I think so, right? Like sometimes the dryer does not, it just dries it too much. And then it's like your clothes clothes are, it's a material object. It can shrink. It can, if you're drying outside, it's just, you gotta have to wait. But, the downside is then you got to iron all that stuff and that takes more time. And there's pros and cons to it, but that is very funny though. I know many other places in the world that people still do, clothes on the clothesline, it's very funny.
Exactly. I'm totally with you on that. I love physical books. I love my physical library, but I mean, in the beginning, when I was constantly traveling back and forth between LA and Cambridge, I would carry my books and my articles with me. Mm-hmm. I would always pay extra for, for baggage. And after a while, I was like, okay, I need to get with the times. I'm studying AI. I can't be the person who doesn't have soft copies of things. So
yeah. I think it becomes one of those things where if I was in your situation, I would just have, I would have a bookshelves in one location and bookshelves in another location. I would just have books everywhere. That's how it is in my house. I have books everywhere, and I've tried to get better at organizing them and making them look nice and everything presentable. But yes, I had one professor in undergrad who had so many books that he had to store them in his like kitchen cabinets because he had no space for them. He just had books upon books upon books. And so, that's always like, okay, I'm not there yet, but I always feel like I'm getting close to that. Okay. So just a few more things here. So I guess just we don't have to get into necessarily CRISPR or anything, but I guess unless you want to, but I guess the one thing is just in terms of the ethics of AI is, I mean, again, this is going to be just I'm assuming a, kind of who knows kind of thing, but, should we, I guess the problem with this stuff is who makes the ethics? Should we have an ethics? How is it monitored? Whose responsibility is it? How much of it is the creators and how much of it is then handed over to individuals that are using the particular, I mean, how do we, I'm not going to sit here and say that you have all the answers to that, but you can please tell me your thoughts and opinions, but how do we create I guess a rubric or some type of system or a grid of considering that, because these are some potentially dangerous things. And so, we got to have something in place, some some scaffolding that can help arrange that. How do you just in general think about how we should have that conversation about the ethics of all kinds of AI? How do you think about that?
It's difficult. It's very,
Why is it so difficult? We can make programs and we can make software and the hardware. Why is this so complicated?
it shouldn't be. You're absolutely
Right. Yeah.
shouldn't be. And there's so many different initiatives going into this, but it's still like who is responsible? I think because there are just a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to talk about it in general because I think again it comes down to what industry and what it's being used for.
Uh-huh.
So I have to say that, when I first started studying AI, I was guilty of being one of the people who said, like, it's really not that big of a deal. Like, you just pull the plug when it gets out of control. I used to have that approach that, we don't need to make AI this kind of this monster. But as I started just learning about the different types of AI. And then more recently, there was a war in my home country. So in Armenia, there was a war, and it was a very brutal drone warfare. And so that
Recently. Yeah.
yeah, that this was it started September 27 in 2020, and it went on for 44 days. And it was brutal. And so that's when I really just my whole perspective of AI and ethics completely changed because, what do you do when it's not just a computer system? And it's not just, let's say, behavior change. It's actual lives that are being lost due to, let's say, image recognition used in drones or just recon drones. And so then again, it comes down to how do you control who is developing these systems? Because, you can have a dictator who is willing to pay any large sum of money to engineers to create a system that is specifically for them, whether that is drones or whether that is, creating a system that perpetuates more biases and discrimination and, let's say, court cases or algorithms or profiling algorithms that, let's say, police might use. And so where do you draw the line? Like how do you prevent these people from creating the systems? Does the responsibility fall on the engineers to say that we will not, absolutely not create these things? Do you hold the person who is asking or, who is creating the startup or whatever company that it is that's going to create this, who is responsible for this? Because they're really, even with drones, you would think that something as important and as destructive as drones would have, an overseeing body that controls what types of drones are made or who it's supplied to or how it's made. There isn't. I mean, that doesn't exist. So if that doesn't exist for drones, then, it surely doesn't exist for other types of AI. And so I think it does become, of course, there will be some common things across the board in all of this, but I think it'll be very industry specific too.
Yeah.
And the ethics, yeah, and it'll come down to also what kind of data you're using, where you're getting your data from, and how you're training your models. It's just like every step of the process needs to be transparent, and that's the most important thing. So yeah, I guess if we're talking about how do you make it more ethical and moral, it's like have certain criteria that have to be met at every step. So whether it's based on the data, the training model, or how it's being implemented.
Yeah, I think that's the really tough part about this, right? Is that it's, I think everyone agrees more or less that yes, there should be something like that, but then what it is, everybody and their cousin has an opinion, right? When you talk about morals or ethics, it's like there's some people who are like, yeah, no morals. And some people want to have a very strict religious one. And, it's just, it's very, very difficult. And so even when you're talking about like standards, people were, arguing and fighting about masks for a year and a half, we can't even, you can believe whatever you want about those, but it's one of those things where something very basic or very simple seemingly is no one can really get on board 100%. And it's just like, you're talking about ethics and morals of AI. It also feels like there's this element of humans that are creating these types of machines that could have the ability to work autonomously or fully autonomously. It feels like there's this kind of like, we don't want to let go of that. Like, well, we don't have the controls anymore. We just give that up. And even in that, some of the things you've been saying, it's like, it feels like we're still holding on to it. Like, I think there's potentially a technologies there where we could just let it go, but we're rightfully so terrified. I mean, wasn't it Stephen Hawking who was like, yeah, it's AI that's going to do us in. It's not aliens. It's AI. It's going to do humans in. And,
Exactly. And
not to sound as super dystopian and post-apocalyptic, but I mean, that, is a real, it's a real thing. It's a real possibility,
And that's the surprising part because, researchers have been sounding the alarm. Like Stephen Hawking said it, Elon Musk says it. There was actually a petition with 3,000 academics signing saying, like, put an end to killer robots. And Stuart Russell, who is one of the main, voices, and he's a professor, he talks a lot about it, and he's constantly calling for an end to this. And he even helped direct this short film. It's like a sci-fi film. It's called Scatterbots. So I would highly suggest watching that. It's very short, but it does show what it could do if you combine image recognition with swarm drones. Then you can kill at mass scale, and it's very dangerous because you don't know who's producing it and at what stage of production they're in. Because no country is going to come out and give away their military.
No, of course not. Yeah.
Weapons.
Yeah. So the one of the last big topics that I want to talk about is, we've kind of hinted at it and talked about it a little bit here and there, but is kind of the future, right? And where do we go? Now, I don't want you to make some kind of prognosis or things like that, but just knowing, I guess within the next few years, you can do 1 to 2 years or whatever, based on what we are doing now and where are things going and how do we understand, kind of things down the pipeline. And then, but maybe before we do that, we can have a little bit of fun. I can't miss the opportunity to talk about AI and not talk about film and science fiction. So we can do a little bit of that if you want. Do you like science fiction? Or no, you don't like it. You hate it. You can tell me, to be honest, be so honest. You'd be like, I hate it. I think it's garbage. Well, how do you feel about it?
Because I don't read science fiction and I don't watch AI.
Okay.
No, and people always ask me, this movie, have you read this book? And I mean, honestly, like, if you ask me about books, I'm going to say I read Dostoevsky because that's what I love. I just love
he's one of my favorite writers, so we can commiserate on that. I mean, I read Crime and Punishment every year.
Oh, wow.
I have for almost 20 years now. It's one of my favorite books, if not my favorite. And I think his low key, I mean, everyone talks about that one and Brothers K, but I think Demons is one of his best works. I absolutely love that novel so much. It's fantastic. Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, The Idiot.
I love The Idiot too. It's so good.
That was the first one I read, and
that was also the first one I read.
Yeah, maybe it was because the first, and I just fell in love with him and his work, and
he's special. He's I have a soft place in my heart for Russian literature in general. And then probably the Brits, they're good. So I actually don't like American literature too much. So people are like, oh, Steinbeck and, Faulkner. And I was like, it doesn't really do anything for me. But, the Russians, they do it for me. I don't know why. Well, I was going to say more about films, but I mean, there are films and shows. I don't know why I'm going to bring it up is because there is a lot of it there's a lot of content out there now, and some of it is quite good in terms of dealing with some of these moral, ethical issues. So my favorite film if I have one. It's hard to pick, but it's definitely up there, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think it's one of the best films ever made for various reasons. It's got philosophy. It has ethics. It has, all the sci-fi stuff. Have you seen this movie? I mean, it's been around for 50 years. You've never seen it? Oh my goodness.
No, I need to watch it because
it's so good.
Many people recommend it to me, and it's time I watch it.
Yeah, it is. I think, goodness, 60, 68, 69. So it's 50 plus years now. It still holds. I mean, again, I've seen it so many times, but when you watch it, you'll be like, I mean, it's impressive, considering the late 60s, what was available to how to shoot films. It's very, incredible. And a lot of this stuff is, very, it's almost like forecasting or foretelling things. There's stuff like tablets and FaceTime in that film, which is insane to think about, 50 plus years ago. So just watching that, it's just like, wow, it's incredible. And I think the other big one is kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier, is Westworld. It's a show on HBO. I'm sure you've heard about this as well.
My sister's been telling me for years to watch it.
It's good. It is really good. It's one of those shows where you can't really try and figure it out. You just kind of have to watch it and take it in, because it's all who's who. Is this a robot, or is this human? And there's all the time stuff and everything. But I guess what many times in science fiction shows and films, at least now, so you can go, all the way back to cartoons where it was flying cars and stuff like that. But I think many of the things that we talk about now in science fiction is these humanoid robots. And, we have stuff from Blade Runner all the way up to Westworld to Ex Machina, which is another sci-fi film. Do you have ideas about that? Is this stupid? Is this just stuff for sci-fi, or is this stuff that is legitimately things that people want to do? And if so, why would we want to do it?
I feel like I need to watch these movies and then.
No. You don't know. Well, you can. They're great, but you don't have to that's just kind of a nice kind of raising it of kind of so people have an idea of what I'm talking about. Many people have seen Westworld or some of the other movies, but it's just people that they look and talk and act and everything like humans, right? And they look like humans. They have skin and everything, but they're robots. And we have some of these elements. In the Alien prequels, right? Prometheus, Alien Covenant, you have the robot that is, looks like a human.
So are you asking if there's any truth to that, or what the fascination?
Well, why the fascination with that, and what would be a use for something like that, right? I mean, I imagine we're pretty far away from that, but why do you think in general, if as much as that what would be a use for something like that? Why would we need a humanoid kind of robotic kind of machine to do things?
Yeah, I think it's just, human curiosity. I to create something that maybe it's okay, this may be totally off, but it's just coming to me on the spot. But maybe it's this kind of God complex. We want to be the creators and we want to see what we can create and how advanced we can take it. I don't know. To be honest, the closest I've watched has been Black Mirror. Mm-hmm. I'm a bit of a softie. These things really stress me out, and I start getting into my overthinking. And
those are stressful, though. Those are stressful, and they are. They're not that far off in the future. These are things that are you could imagine a world 5-10 years from now where many of those episodes are pretty close to reality. It's not that far, right? It's not, they're dark. Some of these episodes are very dark.
Get me into this very existential crisis mode. And so I've stopped watching Black Mirror because of that. I think that's why I focus a lot on just like books that explore the human mind and the human psyche to try to apply that to AI as opposed to watching the AI stuff. But I do need to, because I even I met the man who advised on Ex Machina. He came to
Cool
Cambridge.
film. It's
Yeah,
cool.
he works in London, and so he was explaining all the details of it, which was really fascinating. But yeah, I don't understand. I need to think more about, the obsession with creating humanoids and having humanoids.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it definitely has fed into this whole like hype of AI and this fear of AI and, this Hollywood
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
view of what the machines are going to do to us. So
Yeah, I think there's this like, I think the ways in which, I think what you're saying is right, is like this, like creators, can we create something? Can we create something like us? But I think it's also in everything that we do, or most things that we do, I should say, there's always this anthropomorphizing
yeah,
everything. We anthropomorphize plants and,
yeah,
the house cat and, just anything that we have, even objects, we will, anthropomorphize it. And so then it becomes, well, why wouldn't we do that for robots? Right. And that's where I think it comes. And there's maybe it's a narcissism thing, but I think more than that, it's more of just this, like, we know what we know, and we know ourselves of sorts as a species. And so anything outside of that, we have to just kind of make it closer to what we know, which is us in a sense. That's my biggest guess, and why those things in sci-fi are always, how close is it? What does it look like? Of course, I mean, you have like other types of sci-fi where it's like, the green men or other aliens or things like that. There was there's some sci-fi that's really realistic where it will be like, they'll go to like there's one, I'm forgetting, where they go to one of Jupiter's moons or Saturn's moons. I don't remember which planet. I think it's Jupiter's moons. And they go to like find like life, and it's a little bit of a slow movie, but it literally is like they get there and they do find life, but it's not like green men. It's like, single cell organisms. It's like, yeah, that's believable. Like, yes, that's probably what we're going to find, um, stuff like that. But yeah, I just always wonder, why are we, kind of obsessed with, our or any type of, sci-fi, or, when we're talking about AI, why is it always this kind of anthropomorphizing? And that's, I think you and I are saying something similar in different ways.
that also makes me think of the uncanny valley, right? Because we
Yeah.
don't want it to look too much like us. There has to be some sort of distinction between it looking like a human versus a robot.
Mm-hmm.
So then why do we still, or maybe that's why we create very robot looking,
Mm-hmm.
in these movies, it's very robotic as opposed to human like,
Mm-hmm.
because we want to create it, but don't want it to be too close to us.
Yes, it's right. Yeah, I think then it's too close. Well, I'll tell you, anytime you come back on here, the next time I talk to you, you will have to have at least watched 2001 and maybe a few episodes of Westworld, so you can say like, I get it now. I get why these things are so, like, interesting. So yeah, so just tell us, I guess, in terms of, where are we going, right? Where is the future, right, in your work specifically, and how you're doing things, and how we understand AI, and how it's transforming different areas of work. So not just the automation of, the factory worker or things like that, but in many different fields, right? In the arts, in different creative fields. What's the work being done currently, and what's your ideas about where we're going in the next, you can make it a year or 2 years, 5 years, however far you want to go into the future, but and yeah, what are your thoughts and feelings about that?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I think it's going to go into many areas and probably every area that we can think of. So what I always like to do what I always like to say when I have these conversations about AI is really just look at it in terms of your work, and don't think of AI generally. So don't think
Mm,
of where AI overall is going to go, but think about
mm,
what field you're in, and try to break down what tasks you do or what tasks you would need to do in the next 1 to 5 years, and think about how AI can be used in that. And then think
mm,
about what would be the skills of that system and what would be your skills and how would you complement those two together? Because yeah, one of the main reasons why I went into this area of study and I started making YouTube videos that have been on pause for a while that I need to start up again, but it's just trying to make AI very, a part of our everyday conversation. And I think that's the most important, to make sure that everybody is part of the conversation. I think oftentimes when you hear scientists and researchers, they talk in jargon and these very complex terms, and it just makes it so complex for people to understand, so they kind of just like step away from it and think it's over their heads and they're just not going to engage in these conversations. But because AI is this the newest thing and the latest thing that everyone's talking about, I think a lot of times companies also have a tendency to label everything as AI. And I'm saying this as somebody who has spoken to so many different companies who will, tell me they're using AI systems. And when I dig a little deep and I ask the questions, it turns out they're just, algorithms. They're just like general classic algorithms that we've always had. So I think we need to kind of really balance out this the AI hype and the AI reality. And yeah, my encouragement is to everyone to just get involved in the conversation, understand the basics of it, and understand how it can be applied to your job and what skills you would need to develop yourself, so that you're kind of prepared for this co-collaborative relationship. I don't like to think of it as AI completely taking over our jobs. I mean, of course, I'm sure that in some cases, like it will definitely, I'm sure that in some cases it will definitely take over some tasks, but I don't think it's going to take over your entire job, right? And whether we're talking about in very like menial tasks, like let's say data entry, or if we're talking about knowledge work, like what lawyers are doing or what physicians are doing, or if it's creative tasks like composing music or, creating an art piece or suggesting designs for, a contemporary women's line. So you just really have to look at what the strengths and weaknesses are of both and think about how you can use it to your benefit. So how you can use the system to really augment your own work and better your own skills. So that would
I really like that, because it's a very pragmatic approach to understanding and cooperating with AI as we continue to evolve, and as opposed to seeing it as this kind of spooky kind of thing that's going to take over, is more of like, no, there's positive aspects of it, of course. And how do we, instead of, I liked what you said, instead of this just this broad kind of thing, it's like, well, what is it like for you specifically in your, either your work or in your life, and how are you integrated with that? It seems that maybe this is just to, get clicks or to sell things or whatever, but almost, at least in my pulse of this stuff, is AI is always seen as, right, the takeover, right? Truck drivers aren't going to be driving their trucks anymore. And, everyone that works in a supermarket is just going to be, robotic arms scanning things. Like, it's just people, and it invokes this kind of fear, right? This kind of sensationalism. And my read was like, maybe one day, but that doesn't seem like it's tomorrow. It doesn't seem like it's next year. And even if it is going to happen, it seems like there's going to be a integration of that. So there's going to be a mixture, kind of like what we see now, right? I mean, how long have we had self-checkout lines?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we've had that for what, I don't know, 15 years, I guess. And again, I'm old enough to remember before they existed, right? Right? And everyone was like, oh no, there's just going to be less people that work here. And maybe there has been in certain ways, but we also realize it's like, how many people have clicked the button to say help because this damn thing doesn't work and it doesn't scan this thing and you need someone to override it. And there's always going to be that transitionary period, and people still work in those places. And so, yeah, but I think that's right though, is how do you look at it just in what where your world, what's in your orbit in terms of your work or in your personal life, and what is that, informing and how to integrate instead of just, the robot overlords are taking over. And I guess we didn't talk too much about it, but is there anything you want to say about where we're seeing AI now in maybe other places such as the arts or in creative spaces that we normally wouldn't see? So you've mentioned fashion a few times. What are some other places where, we're seeing this, and what does that look like, and how is it used?
The area that I've seen it, that I've been interested in is looking at it in journalism, seeing how journalists are, like I was saying earlier, you can use things like GPT-3 where you kind of give it you can ask it a question and it can feed back, let's say up to 250 words for you. And then you can kind of use that for it to inspire ideas for you to write the next part. So that's one way of doing it. And another way that they're using it in journalism that I've seen it in sports articles is they give it certain parameters of the team's names and who won and who lost. And it generates this really beautiful article where when you read it, you don't even realize that it's just been, it's an output of a system. You would think that someone actually wrote it because there are actually like some creative, connections between the words and the sentences where it's not just like repetitive, like, this team won by this many points and this team did that, but it's actually creative writing. So in the creative field, I've seen it in that. It's also in music generation, which I think is quite lovely. And there are some websites where you can kind of create your own tunes. I'm actually creating a very short course on this for Skillshare. So that might be out in a month or
Very
two.
cool. Very cool.
So that's looking at, creating your own AI music. And it's being done with paintings. I mean, this has been going on for a while, since the 1980s, but a man named David Cope, he started, the music composition was with David Cope in the 80s. And then there was another artist who did it with paintings of just working with the machine to, create drawings. It's been I'm interested in creativity. So I've really been looking at AI in the creative space. But there's definitely, any field you want, just Google that field and AI and you'll get some ideas of what's going on in that area.
The thing that always comes back to me on this is the philosophical question. I think that is interesting to me on this, and it'll be interesting to see where it shakes out, is the authenticity piece, right? If I'm not doing it and a machine is doing it, does it really matter? Is it really authentic? Is it as organic? And where do we place values on those things, or we see it as inferior or less than? And I don't have an answer to that, but that's the one of the interesting philosophical questions with this stuff.
Yeah, there. A professor at Oxford, his name is Marcus du Sautoy, and he wrote a book called The Creativity Code. That's a good read for anybody who might be interested in that space. And it's actually funny because at one point in the book, he says, I think 250 words or a couple of paragraphs were just generated by AI, but you wouldn't know because even my editor doesn't know, so it's just been there. But when you talk about the authenticity, I do agree with that, because then, it reminds me of this one example of how, so I think it was a pianist. A pianist was given the composition that was co-written by AI. And I think the pianist knew at which point the AI had composed the music, because the flow of the hand positions were very stark. And so as a pianist, he knew that, a human composer wouldn't do that. So it's interesting to see that, the human machine collaboration in that. And as you said, it comes down to the how like real or authentic it is.
Yeah. Well, Alentina, you've been so generous with your time. You've been an absolute joy to talk to. I really enjoyed this very much. So tell listeners where they can find you, relevant places to find you, any work you're doing now and anything else that you want to share there.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. I'm so happy we met and that we had this conversation. And I promise next time I'll come prepared with my sci-fi. You can find me online. I mean, to be honest, I have a hard time saying this because I go on and off apps. So just because I like to take my time away, but I'm,
Sure.
You can find me on LinkedIn or on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
Or on Clubhouse.
Mm-hmm. And you have a YouTube channel as well?
Oh, yes. I have a YouTube channel as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I will make sure to put all of that in the in the notes here. And so I greatly appreciate your time. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, for me as well.
All right. Thanks.